Hi and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi Michelle, how are you?
Hello Caroline.
So this week Parliament returned, albeit virtually.
Semi-virtually.
Semi-virtually, that's right. The government was under scrutiny about the impact of the coronavirus on the aged care sector. And it was the Liberal Party's turn to face some branch stacking allegations. Can we begin there? So the week did start with some allegations of branch stacking in the Victorian Liberal Party and the misuse of MPs' electorate offices. And of course this follows allegations earlier in the year about branch stacking in the Victorian ALP, but we didn't see much attention placed on this during Parliament, during question time. Why didn't the opposition sort of capitalise on this, do you think?
Well, because I think the opposition judged that the aged care issue is really front and centre in people's minds, that to get at the branch stacking story, the Liberal story, would be quite complicated in Parliament, probably not possible. Some things are being investigated anyway by the Department of Finance, but from the vantage point of the ordinary voter, those things are frankly pretty esoteric, pretty irrelevant to their lives, especially voters in Victoria at the moment who are living through incredible restrictions on their lives, and of course this aged care disaster which has been dominating the news. So what the ALP did was really to focus totally in question time, day after day, on aged care. I think that was a sensible tactic, and to put it in context, an important issue, and an issue that affects so many families, many directly, but of course thousands upon thousands indirectly, who have relatives in these homes and who are very fearful about what might happen to them.
So the opposition's had trouble, getting any sort of, free air to get any attention on the issues they want to put forward, or, to put at the top of the agenda. Do you think they're going to get cut through by focusing on this aged care issue?
I think it's the right issue for them to focus on. I do think they'll get some cut through. It's, when you stand back and think about it, pretty awful that this is the sort of issue that they are getting cut through on, because of course we'd wish that this virus had not got into these homes and done such damage. The majority of people who've died from the virus are associated with aged care, but certainly I think Labor did inflict some blows on the government over the issue.
Now, the Royal Commissioners from the aged care inquiry also made some comments about what the government should be doing. Is that usual for them to come out early in an inquiry like that and come hard on sort of recommendations?
No, it's not. Not in an ongoing sense. Of course, they put in an interim report last year, but it is quite extraordinary, really, that they would have things to say. They were talking on the basis of some research commissioned by the inquiry that they released. But they were making strong points. They were suggesting that there needed to be a body to monitor what went on in aged care, standards and so on. They also made it clear that more funding would be needed. So they were exerting some pressure on the government, because they do of course have a good deal of standing in this debate.
And how was that responded to? How was that received?
Well, I think the government would be pretty annoyed, and behind the scenes a few would think, I wonder whether it was a good idea to set up this inquiry, but of course the Prime Minister was not saying anything publicly. He was asked a couple of questions in Parliament about what they'd said, but basically deflected it.
Okay, so we saw some legislation introduced this week. So the government announced that it will be introducing legislation to allow the federal government to cancel agreements that states and territories have entered into with foreign governments. Why is this being announced now?
Well, the cynics saw this as a diversion from the government's troubles over aged care and answering all those questions. I think that it's been in the pipeline for quite some time. Whether the government decided this week was the right one to announce it for other reasons, who knows. They'd be pretty happy to put a bit of pressure on Daniel Andrews, because they're very angry about what's happened in Victoria and the second wave of the virus down there. And an object of this legislation will be to get rid of the Victorian agreement on Belt and Road with China, which the Prime Minister's been critical of in the past. But the other reason that they would announce it at the moment is that the government wants the legislation through by the end of the year. So it's got to get it on the road next week, formally in the Parliament, to have any hope of meeting that timetable.
So what's the suggestion here, you know, with this Belt and Road project? That it's soft diplomacy, that there's, you know, what's the actual heart of the problem here with China?
Well, the government and indeed the community, I think, has been increasingly worried about Chinese influence, mounting Chinese interference in various aspects of Australian politics, economics and life through the universities and so on. So what the legislation does is make the federal government the arbiter of any agreements that state, territory, local governments have, and interestingly, public universities. So it is very wide-ranging. The Belt and Road initiative the government does see as too much Chinese influence, and it believes that given that the federal government, which initially was, if not attracted to being part of this, at least more open-minded about it, but then decided against, the federal government believes that if it doesn't embrace such an initiative, then states shouldn't do so. And I think that in terms of the argument of what states should do in their foreign policy is reasonable enough. The federal government has power, and I think that the states should be in line with Australian foreign policy generally. But I believe that when it comes to the universities, it's a quite different matter.
Yes, what's your concern there?
Well, I believe the universities haven't been wise in becoming so dependent on Chinese students for all that revenue, and in some cases have been seduced into agreements which don't necessarily serve them or the country well.
You have to get your money from somewhere though, Michelle, I've got to say, in the university sector.
Well, that's right, but you have to be careful also where you get your money.
Certainly.
But I think the overriding consideration in my mind is that universities should have autonomy, that they should make the decisions about what agreements they enter into. Now, governments should advise, should warn, should engage in dialogue, and there's already a dialogue underway about how universities counter foreign interference. But I think to say the government has a veto over agreements is simply too heavy-handed and too compromising of universities' independence.
Okay, so let's turn to the contentious JobReady Graduates legislation, which is proposing changes to course fees. So after some pushback from the National Party, social work and psychology have been excluded from the courses that will cop the higher fees. Why did they advocate this? Why is this so important to the National Party?
The National Party argued that these skills were important in rural communities. They needed social workers, they need health workers, and because they'd been classified as humanities courses, students were going to pay a huge amount for these courses, more than $14,000. Now that's been drastically reduced because they've been put into a cheaper band, and the National Party got a couple of other concessions too. I think that it's also leaving aside the validity of the arguments themselves, it's also an example of the National Party getting up on its hind legs from time to time in the coalition and saying, listen to us, we might be the junior partner, but we represent important seats and areas and we want to deliver for our constituents.
So Rex Patrick has, been vocal in his opposition to the legislation. So, what are the numbers? Is this going to get through?
I don't know actually whether it will get through. I think there'll be a lot of negotiation. It's only just introduced. There's this wider argument about the fact that the humanities are being discriminated against. Now the government says that a number of courses will be cheaper or more expensive, and essentially it's skewed to what the government considers will be jobs growth areas. But of course many people would argue that the humanities are very important for preparation for jobs and jobs over a lifetime, when people might not just go into one thing and stay there for their whole career, but have to change occupations a number of times in their life. So I think that there will be a lot of argument about this distribution of fees. There's been a lot of criticism. We'll see where it lands in the Senate.
Okay, so just back to Victoria briefly. So the Premier Daniel Andrews, he announced that he wanted to extend the state of emergency in Victoria by 12 months, and that attracted a lot of criticism. Given the state of the coronavirus in Victoria, were you surprised at how much pushback there was against extending it for 12 months?
I think there are a couple of problems with his announcement. One is that he didn't communicate it very well, and some people who are naturally very jumpy in Victoria thought this meant the restrictions as they are at the moment, which are draconian, would be increased for that time. That was nonsense. It's the legislation that's standing behind what the government has to do. But also, I think many people felt, and I think there's validity in this argument, that to push this legislation out for 12 months meant that there's not the opportunity or automatic opportunity for review and discussion for a very long time. And therefore it would be much better to have it for 6 months or 3 months, or some would argue roll it over month by month. And therefore Parliament has to discuss where the situation is, where the state is, where the use of these powers is. And I think that's important for accountability. Now the state government would say that in other states they have these powers anyway, you don't need special legislation. But I think that the accountability argument is a very central one. And what we're seeing in this crisis is that leaders are trying to push accountability aside when they can. And so we've had parliaments not meeting so much, and we've had a whole lot of quite drastic things done with less discussion perhaps than is desirable. So I think it's a sensible argument to say this legislation should be reviewed. Probably in 3 months would be ideal. And certainly there's been pushback, and the Premier's going to have to compromise on a shorter period than a year.
Yeah, okay. So look, just finally, how did the virtual element of the Parliament function this week?
Well, it sort of functioned. I think they didn't use it that much from what I could see, but Richard Marles, for example, the Deputy Opposition Leader, was in Victoria and asked some questions from there. Richard Di Natale, who has left Parliament this week, some months after he resigned as Greens leader and announced that he would leave Parliament, gave his valedictory speech virtually, and that didn't go quite so well in a technical sense, and there was a glitch and some sort of dropout, so that might have been pretty disappointing for him. But I think that it will improve, but there's not the same dynamic when people are operating virtually. I know people say that in this day and age we should be able to do this and this is the way to go, etc. But having people there physically, everyone there physically, is really what you need for a parliament, although they don't behave so well when they're all there physically.
So I'd heard some people say that they thought it was more cordial, that there were fewer interjections, that in fact that it was a bit more orderly.
Well, that's certainly true, and the Speaker was very tough and wasn't going to tolerate interjections from those who were present. But call me an idealist or unrealistic, but I'd like to see the whole Parliament there and them all behaving pretty well, but maybe that's asking too much.
We'll see next week. Good luck with reporting on it.
Well, they won't be all there next week.
No, that's true. We'll see how it goes. Have a great week.
Thanks, Caroline.